Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this wonderful conference. And apologies, I like some others, mistook a bit, the fact that this is not supposed to be too much work in progress. In fact, what I'm presenting is extremely preliminary. It's the first time I present this at all. At the same time, of course, we're going to benefit tremendously from any sort of feedback you might have. This is joint work with John Riveros and Ilka Gerhardts from Munich, and it's on peace agreements and the attempt to stop a war. The background of all this is that, of course, we've seen tons of evidence and presentations that suggest that peace is good for development and that institutional quality is important for development as well. And then we see, nevertheless, that that's not the case in many countries of the world. We have ongoing civil conflicts, and these civil conflicts are in the way of sustainable development of many sorts. And even if there are attempts of pacifications, these conflicts seem to resurge. They come back. Peace agreements are not stable sometimes. Well, that raises the question, what can we do? So can peace agreements work? And if they work, how do they look like? What can be done? And that was somehow the vague and inexperienced idea that we had at the very beginning of this project. And the one example that we picked, not randomly, was Colombia. Because Colombia is, we've seen today Juan's presentation, very much known for a history of violence and also an attempt to stop that. So the history of that violence goes back decades, if not a century or more, and it's very complex to really find out, where it started, and it's an ongoing evolving process. And what plays a role, of course, is inequality, inequality of access to economic resources, but also to power. And there is a recurrent conflict that eventually, so historically, there was, the times when there were conflicts against government, and then there was the foundation of these famous guerrilla groups, FARC being the biggest one and the most influential one, but also the ELN. But then there is a very complicated mixture of, crime-related activities that are interwoven with these conflicts, and these guerrilla groups, partly, and also the militias countering these guerrilla groups, are involved in crime activities partly to finance themselves and their activities. And disentangling what type of conflict is that? Is that a political conflict, or is it pure crime, or some mixture is already difficult. Now, there have been several attempts to pacify and stop the conflict. Most of them were unsuccessful. But then the country suffered a lot until 10, 15 years ago, it was almost hopeless, at least from the outside. And I was just talking to Felipe that things are still, in certain dimensions, terrible there. So what was the situation? Highest number of kidnappings worldwide. There were extortions, homicides, burglaries, other crimes, and of course, drug trafficking. So a huge conflict until 2015, but then, as was mentioned before today, in the early 2010s, there were peace negotiations, and these peace negotiations eventually led to a peace agreement that affected one of these guerrilla groups, the FARC. There was a ceasefire. It took two referenda until the peace was actually sealed, and then the FARC gave up their guns, and there was a process of pacification. But there was no process of pacification with the other second biggest guerrilla groups, the ELN. So what we are trying to ask ourselves here is then, okay, so what are the effects of that peace agreement, and can we find out what could be done, and what happened? Did that agreement reduce violence and crime, and there have been some ongoing papers, and I learned today that you have even more. Sorry, I should have checked better. But then what we are doing here hopefully is slightly different. So what we are using here is the fact that in the process of the peace agreement there was an intentional heterogeneity in the treatment of municipalities across the country, and that was the so-called ZOMAC concept. ZOMAC are the zones most affected by conflict. And what happened at the time was that the government went there and defined certain municipalities, and these municipalities were the worst in terms of being affected by violence, but also by poverty, lack of development, and armed confrontations. And there was a legal framework that in a law defined which municipalities, according to which criteria, were qualified for this ZOMAC status. And the goal of this ZOMAC status was to help these particularly war-ridden municipalities to actually develop better, and to improve the institutional structure and stabilize the peace. And the target explicitly was to improve socioeconomic conditions, development, and employment. Now, what did that imply? Here are the problems starting in terms of using data, because there is a bit of autonomy and little data of what exactly that meant. So what happened to the ZOMAC municipalities was that they got additional funds from the government, and the goal was to improve government services in these municipalities using these funds, but also to relieve taxes and improve the conditions for employment and businesses. And so these are, if you read this decreto, these are these conditions that define a ZOMAC. Yeah? So it's a poverty index, it's fiscal performance, labor agglomeration, but it's also armed conflict up to the date, and so on. So what we're using here is this distinction between ZOMAC and non-ZOMAC municipalities. How many are there? So there are about 1,100 municipalities in Colombia, and 342 received this status of ZOMAC. In order to get preferential treatment to implement the peace. And what we are trying to find out here is that status and this additional funding of these ZOMACs actually contributing to pacification or the reduction of violence. The data that we use are from the Center of Studies of Economic Development, and they contain municipality level data, including some socioeconomics, but in particular also violence data, and we have data on various outcomes that we're going to look at. Plus we have some economic and demographic variables. We haven't done more than that at the moment, but as I said, we're in the process of working more on this. For instance, we haven't really worked on economic outcomes other than the ones that we observe in the data set. Actually, and we use them as controls only. So what is the empirical strategy that we employ? We have two sources of variation. One is this variation across municipalities, which is primarily focusing on the ZOMAC status, and you could call that a treatment or not treatment, where it's not exactly clear what the treatment is. And we have variation over time. And the general idea, of course, then would be to do something along the lines of a diff in diff or an event study design, where the over time variation we will vary a bit, but also the treatment variation in terms of municipalities being defined ZOMAC status or not ZOMAC status, we're going to play around a bit. But conceptually, the target that we're doing here is this simple kind of diff in diff type of idea. Now, what is the problem, and why are we stretching ourselves with a couple of different identification approaches? Well, because the ZOMAC status is defined as in the law, and it involves a lot of potentially endogenous and variables that might affect other things as well. So this is the distribution of these ZOMACs and non-ZOMACs across Colombia, and I'm not going to go into details about geography. So these are across the place, and they are defined based on these criteria that I was giving to you before. And now, what is the issue here? The issue is, well, are they comparable to the non-ZOMACs, even conditional on observable controls? And that's an assumption that either you are willing to make, or you have to think about alternative assumptions, less stringent assumptions that refer to the actual thing that you need in terms of comparability, which is the propensity of treatment here. And what we do is we do different things. I'm going to show you a diff-in-diff result that just assumes that the ZOMAC conditional on controls is a relevant treatment difference between these municipalities, but then I'm going to show you also results based on a matching estimate, and later on I'm going to show you results on a generalized synthetic control, and then we can discuss the pros and cons and the robustness of these results. So how do we do this matching idea? There are tons of different ways you can do that, as that's clear. So there are 342 municipalities that you can potentially match up with these 752 non-ZOMAC municipalities. What we are doing is one way, which we think is the most clear and transparent way, but it might not be the necessarily best way, which is a one-to-one matching based on a propensity score, which means we're not going to have all the non-treated, non-ZOMAC municipalities in the analysis, which means that we're estimating an ATT rather than an ATE. We match without replacement, nearest neighbor, but we could do different ones. The reason why we think this one is good, other than being transparent, is that it gives us good balance, but also it captures pre-trends. Now, with this matching estimator, the issue is what do you do in terms of the pre-treatment period? Are you matching on the moment in time before the peace agreement went into place, or do you take a history? And if you don't take the history, you want to see, well, are there pre-treat trends or not? And the pre-trend comparability is a bit vulnerable towards how you do the matching. And what I'm going to show you is the one that is actually delivering the best performance in terms of the pre-treatment, pre-trends. But we did other alternative protocols of matching. The results are comparable, but they're not exactly the same as you would expect. But I would say that they are broadly comparable, so I'm pretty confident that what we have is relatively robust. So what do we get? So how should you read these? These are regression results of matched versus non-matched municipalities. So in some sense, this is the difference in the outcomes between the matched and non-matched. And the first line here is a very simple diff-in-diff. So the diff-in-diff says, in 2016 and onwards, I switch on the peace agreement and I look what does the peace agreement do to the differences in the outcomes between the ZOMACs and non-ZOMACs. And the control period is everything that happens before 2015, up to 2015 included. And what you see is that, well, it looks like violence goes down. Kidnappings go down. Kidnappings for extortion go down, subversive actions go down, harassments go down, burglaries go down, unintentional homicides go down, also intentional homicides go down. I don't show them to you because the pre-trends don't look as fine when I get to the other results. But in the simple diff-in-diff, you would see that too. So that was somehow what we expected. But then when you go further to extortions and captures of ELN terrorists, you see opposite effects. So actually, extortions went up. And captures of ELN terrorists went up, and general captures also slightly went up. So the potential explanation of that would be that, well, in these pacified municipalities, there were other things going on. Maybe there was a power vacuum that the non-pacified guerrilla started going in, and taking over violently some sort of criminal activities, or this is the captures of ELN. That was also associated with a more effective police force that was capturing these people. But then, as I said, this is the diff in diff results. Maybe what about the pre-trends? So what we then did was what you could call a generalized diff in diff, where we only compare the results to the 2015 period, and we allow for distinct differences before and after that. So we are basically flexibly accounting for pre-trends. And the nice thing that you see in the pre-2014 equals 1 row is that we basically don't have any pre-trends. The ZOMAC and non-ZOMAC municipalities are comparable. They are not statistically significantly different in these outcomes. But after, we still see the same pattern. Some of the results are not really significant, but you see the subversive actions go down, harassment go down, burglaries go down, but extortions and the captures of ELN terrorists go up. And then we said, oh, maybe we can look at that. Maybe this is just a temporary effect. Maybe this was just on impact and then things disappear. That's why we went for this more flexible synthetic control, event study design that we have here. And it delivers the same picture. So the nice picture here is that, again, you see the pre-trends are extremely comparable for all the outcomes, but you see a reduction in kidnappings, you see a reduction in kidnappings for extortions, and they are persistent reductions. You see that for subversive actions, you see that for harassment, burglary, unintentional homicides, but then the extortions and captures of ELN terrorists, they go up. So these seem to be the patterns that we have. And the last thing is synthetic control. I don't even know what the time does, but the synthetic control is a bit more iffy at the moment, but because what we do is we take controls pre-peace agreement, and then we try to construct for each treated municipality, for each treated ZOMAC, we try to construct a synthetic control municipality out of the pool of all municipalities with replacement. That relaxes, of course, the parallel paths, and we are using a procedure that allows for multiple treated units just to see what is there. The problem there is that it's more flexible in one way, but on the other hand, it gets more data hungry, and that means that the performance before the treatment is maybe less good. I just show you 3 outcomes. One is subversive actions, and here you see that, well, compared to the synthetic control, which remains relatively constant, the treated areas, the ZOMACs, they see a clear reduction in subversive action. And what you see also is the trend in extortions was actually going up all the time, but then in the treated areas, in the treated municipalities, it was going up by more, and there is a gap opening after the peace agreement between the treated and non-treated, or the more intensively treated municipalities and the less intensively treated municipalities, I should say. But what is a bit more surprising, and you only see that with the synthetic control, and you wouldn't see that with the previous analysis, is, for instance, what happens with residential burglary, which I showed you that there is a reduction. The ZOMAC areas are actually benefiting after the peace agreement more than the non-ZOMAC areas, but it looks like that is because in the other areas the burglaries are actually increasing faster than in the ZOMAC areas. That's where we are.